Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming to another NEARC community event. My name is Katie Grillo and I am the GIS Web Technology Specialist at the City of Cambridge, and I'm also the current NEARC president. So NEARC is the Northeast ARC Users Group, and we host two major conferences every year. We have a one-day event in the spring and a three-day fall conference, which is coming up on October 17th through the 20th. And that's really just a few weeks away. Our schedule is posted on the NEARC website, and there's still plenty of time to register or attend. So we really look forward to connecting with you then. In addition to our conferences, we've also started hosting these virtual community events. And these are really an opportunity for us to come together between our conferences and connect with one another, share ideas, collaborate, or just focus on a specific topic that's important to our community. So our speaker today is Clinton Johnson, and Clinton helps organizations create geospatial strategies to achieve equitable outcomes. He leads Esri's racial equity team and also founded and leads the NorthStar, which is an employee community focused on increasing representation and inclusion, as well as belonging for people of African descent in GIS. And some of you from NEARC, you will remember Clinton joined us at our fall 2020 conference as one of our keynote speakers. And we are very grateful and excited to have him back with us today so that we can continue this conversation. So today's Race Equity Workshop is designed to be an opportunity for us to all engage in brave discussions with our colleagues and to learn about applying an intersectional equity lens. So together we will explore, assess, address racial injustice, and we will gain insight into how to center the perspectives of those with the greatest need. So Clinton will be giving us a presentation, overview of the topic, and then as with all of our community events, we will have the opportunity to split into some breakout rooms so that we can discuss and dive a little deeper with one another. So with that, I will pass it over to Clinton.
Thanks, Katie. Hopefully this screen share thing is working right now and you all can see it. Cool.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks for having me back, NEARC. Hello, everybody. I'm Clinton Johnson and I use he, him pronouns. And this is NorthStar Guides, Representation in GIS, a racial equity and social justice workshop, where we're going to explore topics related to equitable representation in mapping and analysis, both in terms of mapping and analysis of people and communities, equitable representation there, and in terms of who's at the table doing that mapping and analysis. And I think another thing to think about is making sure that we are engaging stakeholders in the midst of all that work equitably as well. So, but again, before I get into what all of that means, like Katie said, I lead Esri's racial equity and social justice team, where we provide geospatial resources to help folks advance racial equity and social justice. And I'm the founder and president of the NorthStar of GIS and the founder of the NorthStar at Esri. These are two separate entities. One is a community organization, that both are community organizations. One is employee community, the other one is a nonprofit. And this particular workshop is nestled in between all of that work, the work that I do at Esri and the work that I do through NorthStar. And the goal today is to provide insight into centering the perspectives and the experiences of those experiencing the greatest needs. So over the next little while, I'm going to introduce what you all to this concept of NorthStar Guides, and I'll share some key concepts relevant to the workshop. Some of those concepts will be framed from a NorthStar perspective, and others will be from an Esri perspective in terms of the guidance and resources we provide there. Then, as Katie said, we'll break up into teams and we'll use real scenarios to explore some of those concepts and reflect on, and then we'll come back and reflect on your team's experiences. Then we'll wrap up, summarizing maybe some of the things that we learned through the workshop, some of the things we experienced and some of our thoughts. And then I'll just share some more resources to go a little bit further. So what is the idea and purpose behind NorthStar Guides? The concept is really like in the name and the tagline. It's very much on the nose. NorthStar Guides, positive practices for advancing racial justice, equity, and belonging. And the idea is really to share guidance and information about some foundational concepts to provide some guidance to help folks understand barriers and providing strategies to address those barriers. So to be more specific, NorthStar guides provide foundational concepts to pull together all of the various commonly shared terms and concepts that are related to things like justice, equity, and belonging, or inclusion and diversity. And then we're going to, you know, through that same vehicle, NorthStar Guides, this educational platform, we're going to provide descriptions of some of the barriers that people face when trying to advance justice or experience equity or experience belonging. And then we'll, you know, through that forum and a little bit today, explore some strategies for overcoming barriers and leveraging those foundational concepts to maximize your impact when your impact is to be equitable. So NorthStar Guides complements many other positive practices for equity and social justice, like Esri's geospatial resources that help individuals and organizations use GIS as a framework to advance racial equity and social justice. And Esri provides guidance to help users to leverage the ArcGIS system to create and apply intersectional racial equity lenses to reveal inequities and to identify opportunities to increase justice. So not just looking at where people are experiencing disparity, but where there are resources and circumstances that create better outcomes and trying to find ways to maximize availability of those assets. And Esri provides solution and product configuration guidance to address some of the commonly experienced and commonly addressed equity-related challenges. And of course, Esri's always ready to help folks to sit down and design, configure, and implement geospatial resources that align with whatever your organizational or community equity goals may be. So social identities and social inequities are intersectional. Meaning people experience bias, discrimination, and other forms of marginalization based on many factors. So efforts to understand inequities and to intervene to increase equity and justice must take into account many different demographic details. Moreover, experiences and outcomes often differ for people as they move through the world, so location is always really relevant to these challenges. So Esri's resources for applying equity lenses encourage and enable users to consider many social characteristics when addressing and assessing equity. Social characteristics that often are racialized, like race, ethnicity, caste, tribal affiliation, indigeneity, religion, language, country of origin, all of those things, but also social characteristics that often lead to other kinds of marginalized experiences and often at the intersection of racialized characteristics. So anyway, I'm talking about gender, sexual orientation, age, and disabilities, things like that. And then there are those social characteristics that people think of as indicating someone's social economic group, like income, home ownership, or educational attainment. So racial and social inequities impact people across many areas of our personal, academic, and professional experiences. And while it's important to focus on these outcomes, we must find ways to use data to navigate our way towards the root cause. Many of you will be familiar with this. So I'm going to try to move through it quickly. So racial equity and social justice best practices recognize that downstream individual and group results that impact individuals, families, and communities, all of those downstream things are really influenced by factors further upstream, like access to community assets and conditions where people live, work, play, or travel, like access to quality parks or schools, or access to appropriate medical care and experiences that you have as you engage in those services, and exposure to toxins in the air, water, or soil. And furthermore, racial equity and social justice experts guide us to look further upstream. So we need to look at policies, programs, systems, messaging, and budget decisions by governments, businesses, institutions, and community organizations that influence those community circumstances and ultimately influence those outcomes further downstream. In fact, it's the goal of anti-racist and pro-equity efforts to identify and remedy their the decisions and practices that create or sustain systemic or structural racism, class or gender bias, inequitable access to resources and power, or intergenerational inequities that could mean any combination of the above, impacting multiple generations of families over time. And there's lots of folks who are doing work to really explore and examine inequities, and they're using this kind of approach implicitly or explicitly, where they're breaking down some of the the things that they want to map and analyze and make connections to through this lens of decisions and practices, community assets and conditions and outcomes. So when we look at the lines that shape our cities, this really great story map that explores, HOLC or homeowners loan corporation security maps or redlining maps, the Federal Housing Administration and its policies, and the Community Reinvestment Act and how it's been applied, and the benefits that it can create, as well as urban renewal and displacement, looking at all of those things and considering how they have impacted trees and tree coverage, impervious surfaces and heat islands, and air pollution that people experience in different communities, and making connections between all those things and home values, household incomes, home ownership, energy bills. We can look at examples like Segregation is Killing Us by Territorial Empathy in New York that looked at redlining, exclusionary public school administration screenings, and school safety officer practices, and saw connections between those things and air quality and air pollution in some communities, over and under capacity in schools in some communities, and some of the negative school policing outcomes that disproportionately impact Black and Latinx communities, and are encouraging different new decisions and practices in terms of how safety officers are trained, and providing funding for education, youth, and community programming to impact those community assets and conditions, but ultimately to try to have an impact to drive more equity in terms of COVID-19 experiences and hospitalization rates, but also public school outcomes. And then there's work by the Madre Center that looked at how urban design as a set of decisions and practices have led to contaminants and pollution in certain communities, and looking at decisions about where COVID-19 facilities are distributed, and looking at housing density and all of that stuff as it impacts COVID-19 outcomes again. And folks are, of course, using the data and guidance that Esri provides to apply those intersectional equity lenses to reveal opportunities to increase equity in community circumstances and outcomes, and to establish and sustain justice in their organizational decisions and practices. And racial equity and social justice efforts typically follow a pattern of activities that either is executed implicitly or explicitly, where folks are moving through a pretty consistent workflow to assess needs. And at the center of this workflow is engaging communities. So whether you're mapping and analyzing equity, or you're at a point where you're going to take action and you're monitoring your results, folks are trying to do that with the community in mind and the community engaged. And social identity is very much important. They want to make sure that the folks who are in the community are fully reflected in their engagement. They want to make sure that they are engaging, particularly with those folks in social groups that are most deeply impacted by inequities. And again, there's lots of data and tools that people can use to map and understand racial inequities in their communities, to operationalize racial justice, by infusing equity directly into workflows using automation and maps and dashboards at the right time, and to assess the impact of their efforts. And of course, when engaging communities all throughout that process, people are using things like story maps to put interventions and policy work into context with racial inequities. They're using surveys and so that they can engage many of the organizations and community leaders who represent the interests of the community members that they really want to understand, so they can ground truth their assessment of the circumstances and really gauge what experiences on the ground are like. So just really quickly going back over what I just covered. So racial equity and social justice best practices lead us to understand that inequities are intersectional, and to recognize that racial and social inequities and racial and social identities are intersectional. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a second. Racial equity and social justice streams are a thing, and racial equity root cause analysis is an approach that guides us to look at decisions and practices, community assets and conditions, and outcomes in that tiny little print. Sorry about that. And then we can use GIS overall as a framework to tackle these initiatives. You can use GIS data and tools to operationalize racial justice and to increase equity. So now I want to go through some key concepts that NorthStar guides are sharing information about. I'm going to talk a bit about social identity, about stereotyping and racialization, and I'm going to talk about diversity and representation. And again, these are these guides aren't about necessarily giving you definitions that you've already been exposed to, but it's about trying to make connections between the terms you've heard before and something real and tangible that either people are experiencing in the real world in terms of inequities, or that you can take into your work to start to dig into addressing, understanding and addressing those inequities. So social identity is a concept that comes into play when we interact with each other and when we encounter systems like organizations, processes, and services. Social identities are not always as simple as man, woman, white person, Asian person, architect, or engineer. Social identities are intersectional, and we have many of them, and not all of them do we create for ourselves. For instance, I sometimes think of myself as a technologist or a Black person in technology, or someone from, or a Black person living in Philadelphia. And moreover, when people, start to see each other, they will subconsciously or consciously consider their own social characteristics in relation to those of the social characteristics that they perceive of others, whether they are real or otherwise, or whether those people perceive those identities for themselves. So sometimes people may simplistically see me as a Black man or an African American, regardless of the context, even if it's a work context, and often regardless of my actual age, people may see me as a young Black man. And I'm sure that each of you have your own sense of who you are and the groups that you belong to. And I'm sure that each of you has probably had experiences where people have misidentified you or assumed things about you. This is where stereotypes come into play, right? And so we want to talk a little bit about stereotypes and racialization and stereotyping, right, as a process. These two processes, what are they, and what do they have in common, and what's different about them? So stereotypes are really about assuming in a simplistic way some alignment of someone or some group's social characteristics, like their race, their gender, their age, their abilities, assuming that there's some inherent value in them because of those characteristics, or expecting certain behaviors because of those characteristics. And we all know that stereotyping is something that happens all the time, and it happens to each and every one of us. And then there's racializing. And so this is a process that's very similar. But when folks get racialized, what happens is their value is sort of placed in a hierarchy in terms of their value as humans. And in some cases, historically, and for some people, perhaps in the present day, folks of certain social groups may even be seen as subhuman. So racializing is about creating this stratification of humanity. So they definitely have in common that they're overly simplistic. They're about assigning behaviors and assigning value, but racialization is also about stratifying humanity and assuming that some people are subhuman. Now let's talk about diverse for a second. So diverse is a word that really is about asking the question, is there difference? So you want to apply that to groups of people, to teams, to communities. Is that group diverse? You don't want to apply it to individuals. Inherently, the word diverse means difference. So when you're calling a person a diverse person, you're calling them a different person, and that's inherently othering. So we want to make sure that as a positive practice, we're applying that term diverse to groups. And diversity, more specifically, asks us, well, how diverse is a group, right? And so when we're assessing diversity, particularly in a concept in the context of social or racial equity, we want to look at social identity, and we want to look at social identity intersectionally. So when we look at this group of people, one lens someone might use is just, oh, gender, right? And look there's 13 men, 13 women. We've got gender parity, right? But who's missing? Even in terms of gender, we've got those folks who identify as something in the spectrum of non-binary that don't identify as men or women, and they're not even accounted for very often when people are thinking about quote unquote gender equity. But when we look a little bit further at the intersections, we find that when it comes to, say, assume I know these people, we've surveyed them and we know what their identities are, that 10 of the white folks are white men, and 10 of the white folks, and 6 of the white people are white women. So there isn't gender parity along the lines of race for people who identify as white. There isn't gender parity for people who identify as Black or BIPOC. And then let's talk about representation, right? So representation asks the question, does the group reflect the community or a community? Does a given group reflect a given community? And again, we want to use social identity, we want to intersect social characteristics, and we want to assess locally. Because if we just looked at this, let's say at a US national level, things maybe don't look too bad, right? We've got, this is a small number of people, so it's kind of silly to use this, but you know, imagine that these people represent a staff of 100 or 5,000 people, and 7.7% of that staff are Black women. Well, in the U.S., 7.6% of people are Black women. So that, you know, maybe that looks pretty good. Maybe they're slightly overrepresented, and 3.8% of the staff is Black men, and maybe that doesn't look so good because 7.1% of the United States are Black men, and so these folks are underrepresented by almost half. And then white men account for 38.4%, which maybe means that they are slightly underrepresented from a U.S. perspective, where in the U.S. is 39.1%. But what if this is a company that's based in Philadelphia, where 22.2% of Philadelphians are Black women and 21.4% are Black men? Well, now we realize that white men in this particular context are grossly overrepresented, and Black men and women are grossly underrepresented. And again, all of this is sort of very simplistic and doesn't account for many different factors of social identity, even in terms of gender, it's not accounting for all genders. So before we get into our breakouts, just to recap from a NorthStar GIS perspective. So we talked about social identities. We all have them. They are intersectional. Some of them we define for ourselves, and we're defining them all the time. You join a new organization, and now you're a member of that organization. You get a college degree, and now you're a person with a degree. You went to a given college, and now that's your alma mater, and you are an alumni of that organization. And some are identified by others. People see us, and whether they know us or they are just you know, looking at us, they're making judgments about who we are, which social characteristics we have. And that process about, you know, aligning those judgments are about is stereotyping or racialization, where either we're simplistically assigning value and behaviors to people, and in some cases where we may be adopting into social practices that dehumanize some. And when we think about diversity and representation, we want to apply those appropriately to groups. We want to look at how groups reflect communities, and we want to assess these locally. So I know that was pretty quick, but I imagine you've been exposed to a lot of that before. And now we want to start to prepare to break out into groups. So we're going to put some of these concepts into practice. We're going to so we learned a bit about applying GIS as a framework and some of these NorthStar guides, and through a group exercise, we're going to explore in a simplistic way, but hopefully in an interesting way, equitable representation. And we'll explore the concept of equity streams. So, you know, there will be a set of teams, and as you get broken out into groups, hopefully we can name them team A through something, and teams A, D, and G will have the same scenario. And in this scenario, everybody's going to have a scenario where there are racial disparities in terms of who's living below the poverty line. The community makeup is a little bit different in terms of racial demographics and who's impacted by these racial disparities in poverty. But the gender or sex demographics in this case, we're going to leave pretty consistent. And this will be available to you in a different form when it's time. Team B is dealing with a scenario where we don't have information on the Asian population. Everybody's dealing with the scenarios where we don't have information about poverty in terms of Native American populations. And in the case of team C, F, and I. We don't have information for Asian folks and for people of some other race. And these are things that happen. We find ourselves with data that isn't comprehensive, and we find ourselves beginning these efforts sometimes with social identities that don't completely line up, right? So in the census, we're looking at, the question is asking about sex assigned at birth, but generally when we're trying to assess inequities with regard to sexism and heterosexism, we're looking at, well, sexism, we're looking at gender, which is about men, women, non-binary, and so on. So the first thing I'm going to ask you all to do, and again, I'm going to provide a link to a spreadsheet that you all should use. Find your team in that spreadsheet and fill it out. But look at your own group and just figure out who's in the room, like who's on your team, and so and look at how well your team reflects the community. And we're not asking people to break themselves out. If you have a parent who's Indigenous and you have a parent who's Asian and a great grandparent who's Hispanic or Latino, you count in all these boxes. So you would represent one team member for each one of these boxes. And so if you got 5 people, 5 is the total number of your team, but a person can show up in one of these racial groups more than one time. And that is also reflective in the data that you'll be using. The next thing I want you to do, and I also want you to look at gender. The next thing I want you to do is just think about, well, what are some of the decisions and practices that could either have influenced this creation of a disparity in terms of who's experiencing poverty, and what are some decisions and practices, some policies, legislation that could be shifted, that could create better outcomes, right? So this isn't about making assumptions about what actually happened. This is about preparing to do some research to map and analyze, and you want to just pull everything you can into context so you can start to figure out what data you have, what data you don't have, what you can and can't assess, and try to find some patterns. And everyone should assume that in these communities that they're dealing with, they absolutely dealt with redlining, they absolutely dealt with segregation, and just think about some additional decisions and practices. Think about what kind of community assets and resources that, if made available, could reduce poverty, or that because they exist, they are creating poverty. What kind of conditions may be creating poverty, and what kind of conditions might eliminate poverty. Think about some other outcomes related to poverty that we may not be thinking about as we think about poverty, right? And just start to think about that with your team. Talk about what you find. Talk about that experience of social identity and how you identify, and your experience of filling out surveys and what that might look like for folks. And also think about how your lived experience may impact the kinds of assets you think about. Of course, a lot of us are going to think about some of the obvious ones, but when you really start to ask the question, well, what resources are communities actually dealing with? Well, it really helps to have lived experience, to have experience where people find educational resources that you may not think of beyond public schools. And so for capturing representation, I want you all to use this link, gisnorthstar.org/NEARC workshop/exercise. We will try to get that in the chat for every team. And then when you're capturing information about equity streams, use your own adventure on that. Okay, and then when we come back, we'll just reflect on everything that we learned or experienced. Are we ready to break out?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much for all of that. Can you just put the link back up on the screen for just a moment, please?
Oh yeah, sorry.
And I'll put that in the chat for everyone. All right. So I'll put that in the chat now so everybody can. Great, and I've randomly assigned folks into breakout groups, and those groups will last for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together to discuss. So if you have any questions, you can post them to the chat, but there's a number of us that'll kind of be either circulating or part of these different groups that can help out if you have questions. So I'll go ahead and open the room.
Hey, Katie.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So did everyone get the worksheet?
Yep.
Yes. What team are we?
We are Team C. And I'm actually going to pause the recording. We'll start that back up again when we come back as a group. See everyone coming back in. We'll give folks just a minute to join up. Hi, Clinton. How'd it go?
It was fast.
Yeah.
Got to rethink the timing on that. Yeah,
Well, we did have a question from one of the groups about whether we were supposed to just be doing exercise 1 or exercise 2 at the same time.
Oh yeah. I'm losing track of time. How much more time do we have in total for the session?
We have 19 more minutes.
Yeah. So right, we were going to do two breakouts. So I think it's okay if you only got through the first part. I would like to chit chat a little bit about what folks' experiences were with that first part, and I'll start by throwing something out. I don't know if you all had a chance to really look at the descriptions for those racial categories. They're all based on the 1997 standards that the federal government uses for census and by mandate for all other forms that relate to racial identity. And what we did was put some different language around what the categories are called, but the definitions of those categories are pretty consistent. So we had a conversation about how, despite perhaps some of our connection that we know that we have to Native American communities through our family, well, because of that high standard that says you've got to maintain affiliation with a tribe or community attachment, we rethought whether or not we could add ourselves in those groups. That's something I've always experienced, when really reading the form, and that's something one of the people in our group experienced. We just talk generally, I think, about our experiences filling out forms like this, and I'd love to hear from others. Anybody from Group A want to share what they, some of their discussion, what they thought about the process?
If that's Claire or John or Caitlin or Melissa.
Clinton, I have a question. Was this supposed to represent kind of just an experience of filling out demographic forms in general and our experiences doing that? Okay.
In part, yeah, I think that was an experience that we would just have because, we're trying to assess the representation of our teams with regard to this community that we were dealing with. So we would have that experience, right? We'd be going through this and asking ourselves, well, what do I fill out? And thinking about other times when we filled out forms like this. So yeah, we definitely wanted to have some bit of that.
Yeah, I think both my gender and racial identity is always less than easy when it comes to filling out forms like this, because I know, is there a field for non-binary, and being Latinx, am I white, am I Hispanic? And there's so many terms attached to that specific racial identity and ethnic identity and nation of origin and all of that. So it gets really complicated for folks who maybe have a more marginalized identity versus always being represented in a very clear way.
Flash in a way that you think is very clear. So when we look at white, a person having origins of the original peoples of Europe, right? So maybe if you are of Latin American descent and you feel like you can make a connection to Spanish or Portuguese or other European folks because of all of that history, then you absolutely by this list can choose white. But how many people knew that Middle Eastern folks and North African folks were also identified as white in the US. Oh, I see a hand raised. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah, that's Eva. Have something you want to add, Eva?
I was just gonna, I was gonna comment on something else, but I was interested to see that, and it actually sort of relates to the comment that I was gonna make. I'm always interested when I fill out a form like this, because I think it was Caitlin that was just talking, and like, it's, you know, how do I fit in? What do I need to choose? What are the options? Because I identify as both Black and white, and sometimes you get the option to say that, sometimes you don't. Like, it may say pick one, and sometimes you get to pick multiples, and sometimes if you pick multiple, you have to pick other. And so it's just this very interesting, part of me wishes it were more codified, and, you know, like, everyone picked one way to do it. And at the same time, I'm like, no, that wouldn't be okay. So it's really interesting, and it really does, I think, impact how we think about ourselves. And, you know, why does someone else get to choose how we describe ourselves? Like, you know, it's this constant question.
Yep.
Yeah, and it was also surprisingly weird to talk about it, like, to do that assignment with other people, and having to, like, raise my hand and say, I am this. So I found it very interesting and illuminating, and also maybe giving me more to ponder.
Thank you, Eva, for sharing. And before I go to I want to, it's like these questions remind me of the things that that I know from all of this, like looking into the stuff that maybe other people don't know, right? So there is something, well, and there's something inherently racist about racial categories. And they are always social constructs at the very least. And in the case of the US federal data, they are declared as social political constructs. This is the language that the federal government is providing. And they actually do provide a pretty consistent standard, and this is essentially it. And in that standard, they're really clear that people shouldn't feel forced to identify with one group over others, that they should be able to identify with multiple. And that's been the standard in the US since 1997. They're also pretty clear that when you play that data back out, that you're supposed to look at as many intersections as possible, as many combinations of the characteristics that people choose as possible. However, there's something really racist about racial categories. So when people are experiencing them and they're trying to implement those policies and practices, what generally happens is they just assume that everybody knows what it means to be Black. So I'll just say Black here. I don't have to provide this description. Everybody knows what it means to be white. I won't provide a description. And everybody's just one thing, so we won't use checkboxes. But checkboxes have essentially been the standard since 1997, even though they have, for the US federal government, even though they haven't been implemented that way by many government agencies. And maybe for the first time this past census where they implemented that way for the US census. You were going to share something, and then I think I see Veronique, and then we can maybe go to the next exercise.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Quentin.
thanks, Quentin. So I have a question actually, because, you know, when I was in the United States, I'm from an island, like, you know, an African country, but I'm from an African country. I don't necessarily think of myself always as an African. I identify as Creole, which is never on the mix. And the United States has a lot of people like me from the islands, from like different parts of the world. And so there's a lot of people that are classed as immigrants, and we have to fill up like the census data. So like, I'm wondering if it just always like ends up in the other category, and how like that heavily skews it, because this other is covering so many other,
Right.
because I don't necessarily feel like I'm Black or African American should like be lumped onto, like, African American or African should be lumped under the same category, because there's 57 African countries. and
Yeah.
they look very different.
But you know, racism, the way it works is in America, you're black regardless, right? And for a long time, you're only black if you're black. But the reality is because these are just constructs and we all think that we have that our understanding of race very often is the understanding of race, but these actually could be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, right? But the descriptions is what folks expect you to know inherently somehow. And if you actually take time and look at the groupings, they really tried to cover every continent, right? They tried to cover every continent. So there's this assumption that people just know that they'll be able to find themselves. And a lot of that then gets lost when you just toss out that label Black or African American, that label white, that label Asian, right? And to your point, like sometimes people are, to the quote unquote standard here, misidentifying themselves as some other race, even when their group has sort of been accounted for in terms of these categories that we really shouldn't think of as real racial identities. They're categories that the US government came up with to try to reflect race. And the reason why I think they have a use is because there is an attempt to recognize how racism historically and contemporarily impacts people. So even though, Veronique, you are from an African country and see yourself as Creole, America knows that it thinks you're Black and you're going to get that Black treatment. And in some ways, this creates a tool for people to account for that. But without this, like, you almost need training to fill these forms out the right way. Sorry, Do is the name of a person. And I want to pivot to Do so she can share her comment, and then maybe we can take a few minutes to try that next exercise.
Thanks, Clinton. Thank you for sharing, Vero. So when I do these exercises, it really brings me back, like any of these exercises, not just this one, but whenever I have to put myself in a category, it brings me back to when I was 8 years old in elementary school, filling out that card. For some reason, they made us fill that out at that age, and being confused because my parents never really talked to me about what my ethnic background was that much. And at that point, I knew I was Asian, but also partly European and also Native American. It was just very confusing. And it was just that sense of confusion was happening throughout like my whole childhood until, I got into my teenage years and really tried to understand my background, my culture. And doing these exercises now, it makes me really proud to know and understand like what I am and I don't know what my background is. So yeah, that's just what I've experienced with these exercises.
Thank you all who shared. Honestly, and I want you all to know that in those experiences you're describing that you're having, you're experiencing racism. You experience racism. That really happened to you. That really happened to many people. And the folks who maybe feel like they didn't quite have that experience, you were also experiencing racism, but the other side of it, right? The side that maybe feels affirming to you, or makes you feel like makes you not have to have experiences where you feel othered. And a part of what we'd like to do through NorthStar is to create spaces for just to challenge and to question racism and experiences with racism, and let people know that it's valid. You had that experience, and to try to find paths towards healing, and to also share tools to help people to address these things going forward. So I think it's really important that we understand the categories that organizations are using, especially the government that supports us when they're thinking about race, and to understand that our sense of what our race and ethnicity is may not line up with other people's understanding, and definitely not line up with systems understanding. And to understand that you were right. What you thought you were is what you are, and the system was wrong. I don't think we definitely don't have time to break out into another group, but I think that was just like really important conversation. And I want you all to think about how you can, use this stuff every day, right? And think about, start to develop a skill of assessing who's in the room and who's reflected and who's not, who's missing. And when folks are talking about gender or race or any other social characteristics, that you're also applying an intersectional lens to that. That when someone says, "Oh, our group is very diverse, we've got 50% of our staff is women," you can be one of those people who says, "Well, what about non-binary folks?" And when folks are saying that half of our staff are from marginalized identities, and you realize that almost all of those people are white, you're saying, well, you really haven't been gender diverse because you haven't, because some people who are from marginalized genders like women and non-binary are also Black or disabled or queer. And where can you start to apply this stuff? You can really start to think about this stuff again at work, when you're having meetings, thinking about who's missing, when you're building a team and you're thinking about who's missing. And sometimes when you're having those conversations with a new hire, potential new hire, and you don't necessarily see eye to eye, that could be a great thing, because maybe there's some missing perspective that you could use. Think about it in terms of the TV shows, the movies, the books, right? All the content that you consume. What are your favorite shows, and what is the cast look like? Who's important? Whose stories are important? Whose stories really matter on those shows and therefore are mattering to you, and whose aren't? So we just really want you to take all this work on. We want folks to think about equity and equitable representation in the work that they do and in the teams that they participate in. And if you want to get some help, going further with your equity and social justice work, you can go to esri.com/racial equity, racial-equity for GIS help, and you can go to NorthStar for more of these guides and more guidance. And over the next month, we're going to kick off a new program called NorthStar Guides, where we'll share infographics, we'll share brief presentations around key topics. We'll have live Q&As, so you can come and ask questions about any given topic, and we'll have some of these questions in the context that we call questioning racism, or racism ? So if you've had experiences where you think you experienced something, you're not quite sure, we're there to validate and help you heal. Cool. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, NEARC. Thanks everyone who shared. Thanks for participating.
Absolutely. And thank you, Clinton, for being here and for having this discussion, this conversation with us. It's wild how quickly time can go sometimes. And so thank you everyone so much for sharing. And as Clinton said, there's a lot more resources out there. So if you want to continue the conversation, please do. And we do plan on having more NEARC community events similar to this one. So please stay tuned for more information on upcoming events. And we also look forward to seeing you all at our fall conference next month. So thank you again so much, Clinton, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everybody.